The direction we forgot. What I understood about the West only after I stopped living in it. Since Descartes and the Enlightenment, the mental rational structure of consciousness has entered its deficient phase. Jean Gebser, the book The Ever-Present Origin. For most of my adult life, I lived two lives at once, and I didn't experience them as contradiction. One was the Western life in its full and successful form. I work in corporations. I traveled through most of the major cities of the world, and I do not look back on it with disappointment. I liked it. I am not one who escaped a hollow career and found their soul in a rice field. And I distrust this story whenever I hear it because it is usually told by someone selling the rice field. The other life ran underneath the first one, but for the whole time. While I was doing all of that, I was also reading and practicing things that pointed in a completely different direction. Depth psychology, Jung, the Eastern traditions, meditations. I never made these into a rebellion against my Western life. They simply run alongside it. And I think that double track is the only reason the consumerist world never fully closed over me. I had one foot in something else, and the something else kept the first life honest. And it was that second track that eventually let me recognize the difference long before we ever moved. We did not leave in order to wake up. We left because study and practice had taught me to see what was happening. And I saw it. The Eastern traditions have a word for that capacity, viveka, discrimination, the ability to tell the real from the unreal, the essential from the passing. It is the first instrument of the inner path. And it is precisely the thing the whole world around me had lost. Almost 5 years ago, my wife and I, together with our kids, left Europe and moved to Costa Rica, the country the developed world would politely call less developed. I didn't move to escape anything. What I had sensed and recognized while still inside Europe, this place simply showed me in full clarity. From this distance, from a vantage point I could never have reached from inside Prague or Berlin, the difference is so plain that I can no longer unsee it. In the large cities, a person's will is quietly suppressed and rechanneled. You are immersed completely in a fast and consumerist life, under economic and social pressure that never fully released its grip. The immersion is so total that no vantage point is left over from which you could step back and ask whether the life has the right shape. It is not that people there are unhappy in a way they could name. Many would tell you accurately that they are fine. It is that they live inside an artificial bubble built to the exact dimensions of the human and admitting nothing larger. Here, it is different, and I want to be careful not to romanticize it, because the difference is easy to misread. What I am describing is not some higher wisdom that the developed world has lost. If anything, it is a more collective, less striving arrangement of society with far less of the ambition, the innovation, the drive toward the next thing that defines Europe and the United States. I would not even call it more conscious. In many ways, it is more childlike and naive than it is genuinely awake or mature. It is not better, it is simply other. But that otherness produces one thing the striving world has spent itself out of, which is room, space, because the whole arrangement is less consumed by getting somewhere. It leaves a space the wealthy city has almost entirely built over, a space in which a person could, if he were inclined, actually think. The last point matters, because the space itself is not the destination. The naive, unhurried life is not the answer. And I would not trade a European mind for it. But a conscious person dropped into that space can do something with it that the city makes nearly impossible. He can stop, reflect, and turn his attention to something other than the next achievement. The space is wasted on most, and that is no insult. It is simply what space is. What matters is that the space exists at all. The shape of it is in the ordinary things. 3 generations live together here, not as a problem to be managed, but as the obvious way a life is arranged. And the old are not stored somewhere out of sight, but remain at the center of the family, consulted and present. People keep animals they know by name and grow things in ground they have stood on their whole lives. The day is governed less by the clock than by the light and rain and the seasons. And when a neighbor passes there, it's time, actual unhurried time, to stop and speak. None of this is performed or chosen as a lifestyle. It is simply the world these people were born into. The way the cities hurry is the world the rest of us came from. And every one of these ordinary arrangements has the same hidden quality. Each one ties a person to something that was there before him and will be there after him, to family, to land, to the slow turning of a year he did not invent and cannot speed up. Call that larger thing nature or community or God, or simply the more than me. That is the vertical before anyone gives it a name. It is the daily experience of being held inside something larger than yourself. There is a name for what the city has lost, and it does not come from me. The cultural philosopher Jung Gebser, whom I have studied for years, argued that human consciousness has moved through a series of structures, and that the one which has governed the West since Descartes and the Enlightenment movement, what he called the mental rational structure has entered what he named its deficient phase. In its healthy form, this structure gave us science, logic, perspective, the enormous powers of the rational mind. I do not want to be misread as despising any of that, and neither did Gebser. The problem is what happens when a structure overstays its hour. In its deficient phase, Gebser said, the rational mind stops opening the world and begins to fragment it. Space, which it had learned to measure so beautifully, shatters into pieces. Everything becomes an object, including other people, including nature, including eventually oneself. What I would add in my own words and not Gebser's is that this fragmentation has a felt shape, and the shape is flatness. The mental rational world is extraordinarily wide and almost without height. It expands sideways, endlessly, into more information, more comparison, more acquisition, more optimization of a life that is already full by every measurable standard. What it cannot do, because its very structure forbids it, is point upward toward anything that exceeds the measurable. It has perfected the horizontal and quietly abolished the vertical. I use these two words, horizontal and vertical, because they are the words my own experience hand me, not because Gebser used them. The horizontal is everything you can touch, count, photograph, and set beside your neighbors. The vertical is your relation to whatever is larger than you. And civilization can become unimaginably rich on the horizontal axis while starving to death on the one it has forgotten it has. You can see the starvation in the surveys through a survey that always captures less than the thing it points at. When the Pew Research Center asked people across 17 wealthy societies in their own words what makes their lives meaningful, the answer came back almost entirely horizontal. Setting on family, occupation, material well-being, and health. These are real and good, and I would not take any of them away, but notice what is barely present. Almost no one, unprompted, reaches for anything above the human plane. And notice the drift with age, which is the part I find quietly devastating. The older the respondents, the higher material well-being climbs the list. By 65, it sits at the top in most of the countries surveyed. A whole life spent climbing the horizontal, and at the summit, the horizontal is still the only thing in view. I do not take that as evidence that people are shallow. I take it as evidence that they were handed one axis and thought it was the whole of space. Here I have to be careful because this is exactly the point where a certain kind of writer turns and say that we must therefore go back to religion, back to the village, back to the way our grandparents lived. I'm not saying that, and Gebser would not have said it either. He was explicit that the way forward is not a rejection of reason or a regression to the mythical past, but the intensification of reason into something that can hold more than reason alone. The vertical does not mean retreating into an odd enchantment. We cannot honestly believe it again. And it certainly does not mean the counterfeit that the modern world reaches for when the heights are closed, which is to dig down into the self instead, to excavate one's own interior and call the digging depth. That is still the horizontal, turned 90 degrees and pointed inward. It is the ego studying ego. The vertical, I mean, is not deeper into you. It opens only when you stop being the measure of all things, which is precisely what a mountain or a forest or a family that needs you quietly forces you to do. What strikes me most, living where I live now, is that the West did not lose the vertical because it ran out of the tools. We have them. They are in our own attic. The contemplative streams inside Christianity, the alchemical and hermetic traditions, the philosophical schools that treated the examined life as an ascent rather than a hobby, all of these are ours, Western, native, and almost entirely forgotten. We did not run out of ladders. We decided collectively and without ever quite deciding that there was nothing above us worth climbing toward. And so we stopped looking up. And within a generation or two, we forgot that up had ever been a direction. The strange mercy is that the vertical does not stay forgotten forever, at least not in a single person. Something keeps the appointment even when the culture cancels it, and it tends to arrive with age. Somewhere after 30, often later, a person who has done everything right on the horizontal plane begins to feel a lack he cannot locate or name. Relationship starts to matter more than money in a way that surprises him. A question he has no vocabulary for begins very quietly to ask itself. He usually mistakes it for a problem. I do not think this is a problem, and I do not think it is decline. I think it is the vertical which never actually went anywhere, making itself felt again in the one place the culture could not quite seal off, which is a single human life as it ripens. The real tragedy is not only when the question finally comes. Most people have been given the tools for it. No living tradition, no language, and no one around them who treats it as anything other than a midlife inconvenience to be medicated or distracted away. What I keep wondering, watching my old world from this distance, is not whether the people there are happy. By every horizontal measure, many of them are. I wonder whether they will ever be given the silence or stumble into the kind of distance I stumbled into, in which the other question can be heard at all, and whether when it comes, there will be anyone left who remembers that up was the once a direction a life could go.